Okay, we're on to the next lecture. So open the one that is West Atlantic Forest. And we're talking about Western Africa now. And in the 15th century, the Portuguese called the forest from Senegal to Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea. And you can see that Guinea-Bissau and the country of Guinea are named after this name from the Portuguese. So the 15th century Portuguese, again, called it Guinea. And you can see that, yes, there are very forested areas in this. But when we talk about contemporary art, we'll be talking about urban areas as well. So the earliest known people in the region, you can see some of the groups that are in there. We're going to talk about the Mende today, which are placed in Sierra Leone here, but they actually go across the border. In the 19th century, Liberia was established actually by the United States. So as part of a movement among African Americans, including freed slaves who wanted to go back to Africa. Obviously, that sort of phrase is something that's used in a racist way by white people nowadays. But at that time, the idea is that Black people in America could never be liberated in the Americas. So they thought they would go back to Liberia. And things worked out pretty well at first, but there was some tension between people who were the native Liberians and the people that had gotten there from the United States. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit later on when we get to the contemporary section on West Africa. There's lots of masking traditions throughout West Africa and in the region that we're going to talk about. And the idea is that masking traditions must be sensitive to both the expectations of its empowering spirit and the aspirations of the owner. And here we can also say the commissioner, often the commissioner and the owner are the same, and then the artist. So when we look at the mask, the Sowei mask today, we'll be seeing that there are spirits that are embodied in the mask. There are owners who create certain types of expectations from the artists, and then the artists who are working in styles that make them well known. So the Mende helmet mask, which is known as the Sowei mask, the one that we saw on the first day of class, is for the Sande Bondo Women's Society. So that's just two different names for the same type of women's society. And women, when they are very young, learn the secrets of womanhood in the society. So this is a very difficult type of subject to discuss, but it was one of the subjects that was brought up in Mulide, different culture in Mulide, but similar types of practices and beliefs. I'm going to include a link with a scholar who lived in Britain, but went back to Sierra Leone to have one of these done. She went through the entire initiation process, and it's a very difficult story to read, but I think it's a great source to be able to understand what's going on, because she has kind of a foot in two different worlds. She's living in the Western world as a scholar, and then she's also a Mende person, a Mende woman, and she goes through this entire ceremony. So how this works, like a lot of initiation ceremonies, is, and she'll talk about this in her narrative, is that you have a comfort level in the beginning of the ceremony, and then the young women, sometimes like between 7 and 9, like we saw in the Mulade video, are taken away from what's familiar until they no longer see anything familiar at all. So they're taken to the woods for 2 months. And in the story, the scholar will explain how at first she saw people she knew, her relatives, and then step by step, she was taken to areas blindfolded when she had it done, that were farther and farther away from things that were familiar until she was surrounded by women that she didn't know. The women did the best to make everyone comfortable, but being scared is part of it. And the expectation is that the young women take everything without showing their emotion, without crying or anything. They are supposed to be stoic and strong. And we saw that in Mulade when one of the characters had made fun of Kole, who said when she was going through the cutting, she had cried and peed herself. So after this long ceremony where they're taken to greater and greater unfamiliar areas, at the end of it, they have their clitoris removed. And it is similar to how we saw in Mulade, although sometimes it's done in more sanitary ways than we saw in the movie. But it is done. And when people are asked why, and again, this will be talked about in detail in the article I'm going to post. When people are asked why this is done, there's several different ways of thinking about it. One is probably the way that you're thinking about it. It's a way to control women's sexuality. There's a belief, and this is shared by men and women, but more men, is that women have this kind of uncontrollable type of sexuality. And unless it is contained, a woman will practice infidelity, will cheat on her husband, will be constantly masturbating or whatever. So the idea is if you remove the clitoris, that is a way to reduce masturbation or infidelity. So another way of thinking of it, and again, this will be mentioned in the article, is that when a person is born, they are incomplete. They haven't really taken on their full gender role. And you can think of this as a sex role as well. And the idea is that the clitoris is a male part, and by removing it, a young woman truly becomes a woman. So this may seem kind of disturbing, but it is something that's practiced by a lot of people in the West. If you think of male circumcision, which is not nearly, I'm not comparing it as an equivalent, it's not nearly as destructive, but it is a similar idea in that a part is removed and then that makes you, in this case, joining the covenant with God that goes back to Abraham. So you see that in the Christian religion, but generally it is thought in the Western world, and this is generally the case in the Islamic world as well for similar reasons, that the body is complete as is, that God made bodies perfectly. That is not a common belief in other societies outside of the Abrahamic religions. Instead, many societies see the body as something that is to be modified, to be changed, or to be even individually to be modified and changed. So just kind of keep that in mind. It's one of those fundamental ideas in Western society where it's different in most other societies. So after all of this is done, there's a celebration of completion. And she'll mention in the article about how she was reunited with her family. And the leaders dance with the mask. And the idea is that the mask is the embodiment of the mystical power of the Sande Bando, so the women's society. In this one, we can see the actual masquerade itself. And there's a white scarf on the mask, and it shows solidarity with the initiates. So you can see one of the initiates down below. She's very young, and she's wearing this beaded kind of helmet or hat. And what that represents is the types of haircuts that women used to have. This is another one where you can see that the women are covered with white clay from the water. So it's believed that the spirits of the female ancestors which the girls are calling upon to be able to become women, that they live in the water. And Rebecca Boone, who wrote a great book called Radiance from the Waters, explains this in great detail. So this white clay, a kaolin clay that is near the water, the initiates are covered with it, and then they're expected to dance for their family. I actually wrote a paper about this as an undergrad and won a little scholarship for it. And in that paper, I had to describe the types of dances that they were expected to do now that they are women in a very wonky way that is much easier to describe nowadays. So how I described it is that the young women would bend at the waist and then shake their hips in such a way that made their buttocks seem to detach from the rest of their body. So I'm sure you all know a word that describes that very easily today, but at the time I didn't think my readers would understand it. So you can, if you want, you can use the extra credit board to put in your guess for that word. I have a feeling you know what it is. So what I want you to do now, and I'll include a link underneath this video on YouTube, is to check out the naming ceremony video. So it'll look like this, and the beginning screen will look like this. And it's part of an exhibition of Sowei Mass. And the problem with Sowei Mass and a lot of African works that we're going to look at through the class is that they're acquired in ways that are either unknown or they may have been stolen. A lot of the Mass you see in the museums that are Sowei Mass are usually not stolen, and I'll explain why that is. But some, again, we don't have provenance for them. They just ended up in the West, and they could have been stolen or taken under illegal means. But even without that, the idea of imperialist powers like Britain collecting these masks from a colonized country is there's a lot of problems. So one of the ways that Africans and museums that house these collections have been dealing with it is, in the case of this one, the British Museum asked some of the women in a Sowei society, women from Sierra Leone, who were in London and other parts of the UK, what should we do? And what they said is that we have to call the spirit back in the mask and give it a name, and then we can present it back to you. So check out this video, and you can see in it that the women are wearing these white kind of cloaks and white headdresses, and they're also covering themselves with the clay that we saw the initiates wearing before, and we can see the dots there. A lot of cultures associate this with spirits and sometimes with death. That's why we saw in Mende that the men, when they went to murder Mercenaire, they were wearing white clay on their faces. So check out this video and you'll see how they choose the name for it, and then they'll show a presentation ceremony where they give it back to the people at the museum. So this is one of the many ways. It's not making up for the types of robbery that was going on during imperialism, but it is one way to kind of make these masks available to people outside of Africa, while at the same time giving some respect to the communities that they came from. So let's go back to the lecture. So before imperialism, Mende women wore these very complex hairstyles, and you can see them copied in the Sowei mask itself. So there's a picture on the bottom left, and you can see these hairstyles. Women nowadays aren't wearing these hairstyles, and that's a result of imperialism and neo-imperialism. Women have to do work where they have to carry things on their heads, and they're not able to wear these types of hairstyles anymore because modern imperialism and capitalism has broken apart gender roles and made it more difficult for women to do these sorts of things. The Sowei mask is still going on. The hairstyles are no longer there. So on the previous slide, when we saw the initiate wearing, and some of the women in the crowd wearing this beaded headdress, that's to represent the haircuts that women used to have. So the best dancers, and I told you the types of dances they do, dream of joining the female spirits in a pool. They emerge, leaving ripples of water. So that's one of the explanations for these ripples that you see along the sides of all the masks. I've seen other people where they try to say that it's supposed to represent a certain amount of corpulence, or a woman who's kind of fat, and showing that she is living well. But in the sources that I used, I didn't see that explanation repeated. So I'm going to go with the ripples of water. I think that's a little better. And then we talked about this a little bit on the first day of class, but the other features represent ideal beauty and behavior. So on one hand, we have ideal beauty. So amongst the Mende, two colors of skin are really valued. There is the very dark black color and a kind of caramel color. So what you see in the Sowei mass are the very dark black color, and there are all types of layers of lacquers and such that are added to the mask, and it's constantly polished to keep it this lustrous kind of shine, like a person with a youthful luster in their skin. We also see other ideal beauty characteristics. There's a high forehead, big eyes, a small nose, and a small mouth. But these characteristics also represent ideal behavior. So amongst the Mende, they're what's called a Patrilocal Society, which means if you're a woman and you want to get married, you move to the man's village or the man's city or the man's town whenever you get married. So when you do get married, that means that you're living in the in-laws area with your in-laws. You're living in their town, and you have to follow their rules. So the type of behavior that we see, the big eyes, isn't just pretty, but also shows that you're observing everything that is around you. The small mouth shows that you speak very carefully. So that's pretty important when you're living in a city where people may have different social rules, and especially when you're living with in-laws that may have different family rules. So speak carefully and look before you do. And then the forehead also being beautiful, but it also represents wisdom to be able to know the right things to say and the right things to do at all moments. The bands could also represent the chrysalis of a moth. And I couldn't find the exact moth in Sierra Leone, but this is a very similar one. And you can see how there's ripples here. And then even the way the shape goes up into this kind of triangle represents the type of hairstyles that we see on the Sowei mask. So a chrysalis of a moth for a feminine initiation ceremony makes a lot of sense. Even in the West, kind of in the old style of sex education, they would say as a woman turns into a butterfly, meaning she grows up into a woman when she's going through puberty. So this type of transformation that we see with the moth is the type of transformation, not just like a morphological transformation, but a spiritual transformation that young women would see when they're initiated into the Sowei Society. So it's important to understand, and this was something that wasn't in the classes where I had this, where this was talked about before, is that you have the Sowei mask on one hand, and it represents a certain type of feminine ideal. But then masks, when they get worn out, they are used to represent the Gande, who it literally means clown, but it's more than that. This is a contrast to the Sowei. So you can see once the mask gets worn out, they cover it with paint to show that this is a different type of feminine figure. So Boone says, any discussion of the nobility of the human Sowei is not complete without recounting the faults of the human Gande. So both Nagafa spirit apparitions are far above human beings. They may be opposites, but they are equals. So think about what this mask represents, the Sowei mask. It represents a certain type of ideal beauty and ideal behavior. But that's difficult. It's the type of thing where it requires constant maintenance, and it's also limiting your freedom. So on the other hand, a woman can live like the Gande, in that she doesn't have to take care of her looks all the time and look perfect all the time. Her hair doesn't have to be perfect. Her skin doesn't have to be perfect. But with that, she also gets freedom to speak freely. And we saw a little bit of that in Mulide when we saw the one character who was the female griot, the one that would sing, and at the end she sang the warrior song for Kole. They talked about how she always can hang out with men, and we can see that she spoke very freely. And when it came to putting the mini revolution they had in Mulide into words, she was the person that put it into words. So there's a certain amount of freedom there. But as we saw in Mulide, women that are like this are not likely to get married. But again, there's a certain amount of freedom, which means they can have multiple boyfriends. So again, we see the Sowei is a particular type of ideal, but there's a space made for women to break out of that ideal and have, hence, more power and more freedom. So it's important to remember that type of contrast. If you think of traditional gender roles in Western society, which have obviously changed, but if you think back into decades, women were limited to only what we see on the right, to looking a certain way and following their rules and speaking carefully and sometimes not even speaking at all. There wasn't a role that we see here. So this is a role amongst the Mende people that they consider to be important. And again, as Boone says, these are equal spirits. So you're probably wondering, why is this ceremony still going on, especially with this association with female genital mutilation? So we saw a little bit this in Mulide, that the Salandana had a certain amount of power and influence, and they could get some money from being part of this society that performs the initiation. And we see the same thing amongst the Mende, but even more profound. So in pre-colonial times, women could hold the position of chief of a village cluster. Until the 1970s, women politicians continued to use the Sande society to support and further their careers in modern government. With increasingly rigorous Islamization, however, the Sande society is even being seriously modified or even disbanded. And it's important to understand what I mean by Islamization. I'm not talking about Islam as limiting roles for women. If you study Islam, especially like Muhammad specifically, in early Islam, you'll see that there's quite a strong role for women. And modern Islamic countries that are repressive towards women are a rather new phenomenon. So what I'm talking about here is how Islam is used as a rationalization for limiting women's roles and taking away these types of women power that are embodied in things like the Sande society. So we saw that again in Mulide. We saw that the men, when they talked about the cutting, the purification, that they said it was required by Islam. But if you remember what Kole said she listened to the Grand Imam on the radio and said that it's not required by Islam, which is correct. This particular ceremony and removing the clitoris almost certainly predates Islam in this area. And Islam is used, especially in more recent times, and especially in post-colonial times, where where these types of societies for women's power were discouraged, also in post-colonial times, that men are taking advantage of this to enhance their power and limit the power of women. So that's something to keep in mind when people are talking about, why is this still being done, even though it's obviously harmful? So it's important to understand the stakes that different people have. And again, Mulide was a pretty good example of seeing some of the stakes. And this example I'm going to give you on the left comes from a woman who's part of the Sowei Society, and she was speaking before a human rights panel in the UN. And the reason why I want you to read this is because a lot of times when FGM is talked about in the West, the issues are discussed from a point of view of Western people. So obviously there's objective dangers to FGM, and we saw some of those in Mulade. But there's also effects that aren't necessarily shared by all women, and that's not necessarily understood by people in the West. The other problem is that the same type of Western activists are coming from the same countries that are imperialist or neo-imperialist countries. So from the UK and from the United States, from France. And that means when we see representatives of Western imperialist and neo-imperialist powers talking about eliminating this, a lot of people in Africa can see this as part of the imperialist or neo-imperialist program. So the woman from the Sowei Society is talking about how people look at it from the outside. So she says, Madam Chairman, the right of female circumcision is sacred, fearful, and respected. It is a religion to us. It is a form of school where initiates are taught youthful behavior. Candidates undergo an incomprehensible process of metamorphosis and come out whole and complete women. The process imbues intakes with knowledge, wisdom, and acceptance to a higher social standing. It is so important in Sierra Leone that the social structure is laid down by this sacred ritual. So again, the point of view associating the Sowei Society and its initiation ceremonies with FGM is different for Africans. She's talking about how this is a basis to their society and also helps women. So continuing, the importance of women in our society depends on a successful and holy graduation from the initiation. It is a ritual of transformation from a girl to a woman with respect, dignity, honor, and responsibility. Therefore, when some alienated, half-civilized change agents sit at conference tables with microphones and urge us to jettison our sacred rite of passage without consulting us, they are trying to unmake us. They are snatching from us our behavioral pattern and social importance. As we have already seen, one of the techniques of imperialism and neo-imperialism and the spread of global capitalism is to kind of destroy the basis of people's beliefs and rituals. And the woman here is referencing those types of ideas, also talking about how these outsiders are half-civilized change agents. And again, a reference to imperialism. You can see when we look at, especially when we get into more details later on, that the ravages of imperialism and neo-imperialism are savage against Africans. So calling them half-civilized makes a lot of sense. And then when they say alienated, meaning alienated from their own traditions, that's what she's talking about in that one. So that's part of the reason why I show you Mulade. If I just showed you a Western-produced video on FGM, you might see some things that are useful. But I wanted to show you how for this type of change to happen, for this type of ritual, and I believe that FGM is inherently repressive, to stop, that it needs to come from within the culture. So that's why Mulade, to me, is an important way to look at it. We saw it literally coming from the lowest rungs of culture, from the young women up through the women, and they collectively organized to at least temporarily stop this practice. So we saw some of these on the right. We saw some of these elements where the people like the Salendana who practice this ceremony, they have some self-interest, and they also don't always have the best interests of the initiates in mind. So, for example, the Imperados wrote that the Sowei Society serves as an avenue for women to achieve high status, political authority, and economic success. Some women even compete for initiates, which is part driven by the revenues involved and a desire to maintain or increase status. In Mulade, we saw that element. the Salandana were talking about how they were bringing in women from faraway villages and were getting paid in money and expensive French soaps. So as in many societies around the world, elder women are often the ones desirous of maintaining practices that are potentially detrimental to younger women. At the same time, older women are more likely to be widows in war-torn Sierra Leone and Liberia and suffer from poverty. Hence, economic considerations and the associated desire for their daughters to marry without difficulties also explains their support of FGM, issues not addressed by the authors. So Cynthia Becker is criticizing the exhibition notes for this Imperado's show of the Imperado family collection of Mass. So that's an important thing to remember. One of the effects of neo-imperialism and the desire for the West to get a hand on as many resources are the civil wars that have been going on in Sierra Leone, in Liberia. And these civil wars are in part driven by the types of resource extraction that is being practiced within the country and then going out to the West, to the United States, to Europe, to Asia sometimes. So these issues are really important to understand as best as you can from the point of view of Africans, especially if you are interested in stopping this particular practice. So that's the end of the show. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. And again, let me know if you have any questions.